Today we want to have a closer look at how to operate a Zeppelin. So we will talk about the physics behind Zeppelins and we will look at some forgotten knowledge. First of all, the idea for airships came from Ferdinand Zeppelin's experiences with hydrogen balloons in the American Civil War in the 1860s and the German-French War in 1870. If you want to know more about the beginnings of Zeppelins, check out my part 1 of this series. So, the General Zeppelin was impressed by the potential of gas balloons, but the big problem was you cannot steer them. After his retirement, he started working on this new project. His idea was to install an engine and rudders. This requires more lift, but instead of making the balloon bigger, he put multiple gas balloon cells behind each other. That kept the frontal area the same, but created a longer vehicle, good for directional stability. And just to be clear, there are multiple airship designs, but in this series we concentrate on Zeppelins. So Zeppelin's idea was to design a lightweight frame to house multiple gas cells. That brings us to the 3 different categories of airships: rigid airships, semi-rigid airships, and non-rigid airships. Non-rigid airships have the advantage that they only have one large aerodynamically shaped gas bag. So if you release the gas and it deflates, the airship is very small. Disadvantage is that because it's not rigid, you cannot fix mechanical components like engines or rudders to the hull. During the wars of the 19th century and the First World War, a significant disadvantage was also that if this one large gas bag is leaking because of bullet holes, the hull deflates and the airship goes down. Rigid airships have a lightweight frame with gas bags inside. The frame was made out of wood for some airships or aluminium for Zeppelins. Advantage is now that the outside shape always stays the same. You can create much larger airships because you have a rigid frame which you can extend to the back and add more gas bags. Because you have multiple gas bags, you have less of a problem if one of them is leaking. You still have other intact ones. And because of a rigid frame, you can walk through the ship and repair gas bags while flying. Also, you can now fix mechanical rudders and engines to the hull. Having larger airships with more gas bags also means you can take more ballast like fuel, which allows for much longer operating times. Disadvantage is that you need massive hangars and these airships have a higher weight. Also, the construction is quite complex and needs more material. The semi-rigid airships combine both designs. It's basically a non-rigid airship, but with an additional lower frame to hang engines and to fix it properly at the nose. To understand how Zeppelins work, we need to discover lift first. Great about balloons and airships is that they are lighter than air. So there is lift without any additional input. Planes need to fly with a certain speed, so their wings create enough lift to stay in the air. Helicopters must rotate their rotor to create enough lift. So that all requires engines, fuel, and that's noise. Lighter than air vehicles are filled with the gas, which creates the lift. So it's completely silent. And even if I switch the engines off, I can still float in the air. So let's calculate the lift. Let's assume we have a balloon with 1000 cubic meters of volume. If it's filled with air and air is also surrounding the balloon, there's no difference between both gases and there's no lift. So we need a gas that is as light as possible. You could also heat the air up, which reduces its density. If we don't use the burner for a while, the gas cools down and the lift reduces. But let's have a look at gas balloons. If we now look at the chemical elements, we can see that the lightest gas is hydrogen. Nice is also that it's easy to produce and it's available everywhere. So hydrogen has a density of 0.09 kilogram per cubic meter. Air has a density of 1.27 kilogram per cubic meter. Because we now replace the air in the balloon with hydrogen, we calculate the difference in density. So it's 1.27 minus 0.09 equals to 1.18 kilogram per cubic meter. In other words, 1 cubic meter produces 1.18 kilogram of lift. And since we have 1000 cubic meters, we now have a balloon with 1180 kilogram of lift. But because the balloon with ballast weights and passengers has a own weight of 900 kg, the resulting lift is 280 kg. If we multiply that with g, we get the lift force, which is 2750 newtons. A disadvantage of hydrogen is that it's highly flammable, and when it's mixed with oxygen, it's even explosive. If we go back to our chemical elements, we see that another light gas is helium, but it's on the very right side, which means that it's an inert gas, so it doesn't mix with other elements. You can only find it in its pure shape, and before the Second World War, the United States were the only country who could supply it. More on that and what it meant for German Zeppelins later. Helium has double the density of hydrogen. If we now replace the hydrogen in our balloon with helium, we get 1.09 kg of lift per cubic meter, so it's 8% less than with hydrogen. Let's talk about operating a Zeppelin now. A Zeppelin has a large skeleton and is sitting on supports in the hangar. Large tubes fill the gas bags with hydrogen. The bags are usually filled to a maximum of 95%. The Zeppelin is loaded with ballast water in huge tanks, fuel and other cargo, so we have the maximum takeoff weight for the mission. If the preparation is done, a large group of people grabs the handles around the Zeppelin, holding it and keeping it on the ground. They are then pulling the Zeppelin out of the hangar, and that is a crucial moment. Because of its large size, a Zeppelin is very sensitive to crosswinds. Very often these large airships got damaged by crosswinds when they were pulled out of the hangar. That's why you always fix a Zeppelin only at the nose, so it can turn itself into the wind. Also, for that reason, the first Zeppelin hangar was floating on water and could turn itself into the wind. Later hangars on land couldn't do it, so wind conditions were important to get a Zeppelin out of the hangar. The later Zeppelins in the 1930s had a rail system to drive a Zeppelin out of the hangar and turn it into the wind. So now that the Zeppelin is out of the hangar, the so-called Haltemannschaft, so the group of people holding the Zeppelin on the ground, can let go on command of the captain, and some ballast water is being released. The Zeppelin now rises. With higher altitude, the density of the surrounding air decreases, which expands the hydrogen gas in the gas bags. That's the reason why these bags are never filled to 100% on the ground. Also, because the air density decreases, the density difference between hydrogen and air reduces, which means a reduction in lift. So there's a natural maximum altitude. If we now want to get higher, we can release water ballast. Air density decreases even more, and because of that, our hydrogen gas wants to expand more, but the bags reached their maximum volume already. The result is that pressure within the gas bags increases, and there is a maximum pressure these bags can take. And so Zeppelins had a pressure relief valve for gas bags and chimneys at the top. Hydrogen is lighter than air, so you want to release it at the top. But you had to be careful, because if lift increased too much and too quickly after you dropped a lot of ballast, for example when dropping tons of bombs, it was possible that gas bag's pressure increased too quickly because the Zeppelin rose up and the relief valve couldn't release gas quickly enough and gas bags could explode. So if Zeppelins were flying too high, they lost a bit of their hydrogen gas. That means that they would need to refuel more hydrogen at the next airport. Because we have a rigid airship, we can also use the dynamic lift with rudders at the back. So that's another possibility to increase altitude and point the nose upwards. But you need engine power for that. So now we are up in the air and traveling for hours. Zeppelins were burning tons of fuel and oil during flight, and hence they got lighter. If they wanted to keep a certain altitude because of useful winds, they had to release some hydrogen, which then again required more refueling of gas at the next airport. Let's look at one example. The Hindenburg used 54 tons of diesel oil for the trip from Frankfurt to Lakehurst. This equals to the lift of 48,000 cubic meters of hydrogen. Since the Hindenburg had 200,000 cubic meters overall, you can see that they needed to release almost 1/4 of their gas to land the Zeppelin. So Zeppelin engineers worked hard on innovations to increase ballast during flight. For example, they developed a system to catch rainwater from the large hull, which would get them a few tons extra ballast. And for the last and most modern Zeppelins in the 1930s, they designed a system to condense water from the exhaust gas of the engines, which gave them another few tons of water ballast. These systems allowed them to reduce their hydrogen consumption. Also, releasing hydrogen means it's mixing with oxygen, creating an explosive gas around the Zeppelin, so they wanted to avoid that as much as possible. Another important factor which influences lift is temperature. The lower the temperature of the ambient air, the higher is its density. So the density difference between air and hydrogen is at its maximum, so you have maximum lift. For that reason, Zeppelins preferably started in the early morning at the lowest temperatures of the day to have maximum lift when they are fully loaded. At warm weather, it was the other way around. Also, the sun could heat up the hull and expand the gas in the Zeppelin. This increased pressure and the Zeppelin had to release hydrogen. For that reason, Zeppelin hulls used a cover with reflective aluminium particles, which gave them their shiny appearance. Especially during the First World War, rain was a problem. If a Zeppelin heavily loaded with bombs got into rain, it got up to 7 tons heavier and hence was flying lower, so it was easier to shoot it down. If they dropped water ballast to fly higher, it often wasn't enough, and they didn't have any ballast to play with during landing. And landing is another crucial situation. Zeppelins always had a ground crew at every airport to hold the airship on the ground. On approach, Zeppelins would drop their ropes, also called spiders, so the ground crew could grab it and pull it to the ground. The Zeppelin used its rudders to point the nose down to reduce lift, but it still had to release hydrogen to balance out the vehicle. So the Zeppelin was going down, and to make a softer landing, they dropped ballast just before they touched the ground. Sometimes, if a Zeppelin came back damaged and it didn't have any ballast to drop anymore for a softer landing, the captain instructed the crew to jump off the ship just before they touched the ground. If a Zeppelin did an emergency landing somewhere in the landscape, that was also necessary because there was no ground crew, so the Zeppelin crew quickly jumped off while still being in the air, grabbed the ropes and held the Zeppelin on the ground. The nice thing about airships in general is that lift is always there and doesn't have to be generated with engines. So if you want to save fuel, you can run on 2 engines instead of 5, which is what the Germans did when they silently wanted to enter Britain in the First World War. If an engine needs to be repaired in a Zeppelin because of its rigid design, you could walk to the engine during flight and work in the engine compartment. Also, fuel was a huge development topic. Earlier Zeppelins always had petrol engines, but the problem was the weight loss during flight. So the idea came up to use fuel with a similar density to the surrounding air, so the density difference and hence the lift change during flight wasn't as bad. So for the highly successful LZ-127, they used gas to run the engines instead of petrol. This Zeppelin broke a couple of records and was even flying around the world. But the volume the gas needed inside the hull was quite big, so for the next and final generation they changed back to liquid fuel. But now they changed to diesel, so engines didn't need an ignition system anymore, which reduced the risk of fires. Zeppelins with petrol engines and hydrogen gas were already well proven at that point for 30 years and throughout the First World War, but engineers were constantly trying to make them even better. So the next step was to eliminate the last big risk of Zeppelins, the hydrogen gas. Although Zeppelins were proven in all sorts of weather conditions around the world, including thunderstorms and being struck by lightning, the hydrogen was never an issue, if you didn't release it and it mixed with oxygen. To eliminate this last risk, there were 2 strategies: creating a nitrogen cover around the hydrogen bags or design airships for helium. They decided to design the new generation for helium, which meant they have 8% less lift, as we learned before. So the design was even more lightweight, and they even designed a lightweight aluminium piano for the new Zeppelins. Because the USA was the only helium supplier in the world at that time, it was a risky move. Americans promised supply, the Germans designed and built the new generation of Zeppelins, installed all necessary equipment for helium at the Frankfurt airport, but the deal got delayed and delayed. The Germans were already done with Hindenburg, filled it with hydrogen, because until now it worked fine, and it even gave them 8% more lift, so they could carry more load. And suddenly, after many successful journeys to America and being in service for over a year, the Hindenburg was exploding at the rear end when approaching Lakehurst, USA in 1937, and in front of all the TV cameras. The surviving, war-experienced crew couldn't understand how this happened, and until today the cause isn't found. The Germans now really needed helium to keep the airships going because people were scared to fly with hydrogen, and the picture is still in people's head until today. In early 1938, the USA denied the deal, and that was the end of the large Zeppelins. We will talk about this last generation of Zeppelins and the end of this era in a lot more detail in one of the next parts. So I hope you liked this insight into the technology behind Zeppelins, and if you did, please consider to become a B-Sport Club member for more videos like this.